Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. So glad everyone made it before the storm front does. We'll see how well and secure we are in the building the rest of the afternoon. We would ask everyone here in-house, if you'll be so kind, to check that your cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. It's a courtesy always appreciated by our speakers. And of course, we will post the program on the Heritage homepage for your future reference. Hosting our discussion today is Hans von Spakovsky. He is our Senior Legal Fellow in the Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. He also manages Heritage Civil Justice Reform Initiative. He studies the legal aspects of elections, such as campaign finance, voter fraud, voter identification laws, as well as registration and even equipment issues. Prior to joining us here at Heritage, and relevant especially for today, he served for 2 years as a member of the Federal Election Commission. Prior to that, he was a counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Justice. He is also a former litigator, and he has served in positions on the Board of Advisors of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission in Fulton County, Georgia, as well as a member of the Fairfax County, more locally in Fairfax, Board of Election Board. Please join me in welcoming Hans von Spakovsky. Hans?
Well, this is really appropriate to have it today. My wife told me last night after I got home from the office that she had finished doing our taxes. So with April 15th rapidly approaching, it's probably a good thing for us to do something about the agency that most Americans either dislike or fear. And we're having this session because it appears the IRS may be once again targeting certain organizations in order to censor their speech. You all know that this effort has been supported by certain members of the administration. Just a couple of weeks ago, Senator Chuck Schumer of New York said he wanted the IRS to redouble its efforts in this area. We have an investigation that supposedly is being conducted by the Justice Department. We know also several committees in Congress are looking at the IRS targeting of Tea Party and other conservative organizations who were applying for tax-exempt status, mostly under Section 501c4 and some under 501c3. And as you all know, back in May of last year, the Inspector General at the Treasury Department released a report in which he said that IRS officials were using inappropriate criteria, and in fact were asking for all kinds of voluminous, burdensome information and documents to which the IRS was not entitled and which were not relevant to their exemption, such as membership information. Now, some of those organizations have still not been granted their tax-exempt status, and 2 weeks ago, I think, was it, I think Cleta was testifying in front of Congress, and I think she still had not been contacted by the FBI, who's supposedly investigating this, to talk to any of her clients, of which she represents, I think, about 2 dozen. Now, the other thing that has happened on top of all this is that the day after Thanksgiving, when most people were home with their families and not paying any attention to what was going on in Washington, the IRS published an NPRM, that's Washington speak, an acronym for a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking in the Federal Register. And that proposed rulemaking would redefine what the IRS considers candidate-related political activity by 501c4 organizations, the very kind of organizations that were targeted by the IRS. Now, these definitions, these new definitions, are so wide-ranging and so broad that they would severely restrict a lot of the political speech and other activity of these organizations. And that doesn't matter whether it's a conservative organization or a liberal organization. In fact, there have been, I think we just looked, and there were something like 26,000, I think. 67. We're up to 67,000 public comments have been filed. Next week is the deadline, including not just by organizations such as Heritage, which has filed one, and it's available outside, but also the ACLU has come out against it, as well as, I believe, the Sierra Club. To talk about all of these issues today, we've got 2 lawyers, leading experts on campaign finance and tax law, and I'm going to introduce everyone going down the line. And then we're going to start. Cleta Mitchell is first. She's a partner at Foley Lardner and a member of the firm's political law practice. She's an expert on campaign finance law, election and lobbying law, and as I said, represents a number of the conservative organizations that were targeted by the IRS. She is a former state legislator, a very experienced lawyer. Her resume is extremely long. We could spend the entire session just going through all the things that she has done. But she is well known in Washington and the kind of person you want on your side when you're fighting the government. I have to agree with that. Bradley Smith is a former chairman of the Federal Election Commission, and as it so happens, I actually took his seat after he resigned on the FEC. He's the Blackmore Vault Professor of Law at Capital University Law School, where he has taught since 1993. He's also taught at George Mason University School of Law. In 2010, he won the Bradley Prize, and again, he's also one of the leading authorities on election and campaign law. He's the author of numerous books, law review articles, and actually did a piece in the Wall Street Journal not too long after these proposed regulations came out that did a very good job summarizing the many First Amendment problems with them. Next, we have two experienced journalists who've been covering both of these stories. Eliana Johnson is a political reporter at National Review, where she writes about Congress, the administration, and the media. She covered the IRS extensively from the time, the scandal, from the time it broke in May. And she was actually the first to report that it was orchestrated out of Washington rather than Cincinnati, as the agency in the Obama administration initially claimed. Before joining National Review, she worked as a producer at Fox and as a research assistant at the Council on Foreign Relations. Finally, we were going to have Kimberly Strassel, who's a member of the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. She writes the weekly Potomac Watch column from Washington. She joined Dow Jones in 1994 as a news assistant with the Wall Street Journal Europe in Brussels. In 1996, she moved to the London Bureau as a reporter, and in 1999, she transferred to New York. She joined the editorial page as an assistant editorial features editor in 1999, and in 2002, she became an editorial page writer. She assumed her current position in 2005 when she moved to Washington, and she lives in Virginia with her husband and 3 children. So now we're going to start with Cleta.
Do you want us to come up there or stay here?
You all can speak from there or from here, whatever you'd like.
I'll sit down. All right. Are you going to put my little PowerPoint on? Oh, it's on the side. All right. Well, Uncle Sam wants you, and the IRS wants you, to stop doing certain things. And I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what these regulations would do if adopted. I'm not going to go through all of the horribles because it would take too long to do. And I can just tell you that I was making my grocery list on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, thinking finally to get a break from thinking about this administration and the IRS, which is something I've been doing a lot of for several years. And I started getting emails from reporters saying the IRS has just announced that it's going to issue regulations. And I knew without even seeing what they were, I knew it was going to be bad. And I knew as well that it wasn't an accident that the first notice came 2 days before Thanksgiving, as people like me were making grocery lists. And they were issued on the Friday after Thanksgiving. Now, who has a picture of some people really just sweating to get something done on the Friday after Thanksgiving as an IRS employee, right? What they did was that they essentially cost us about 40% of the comment period, because I knew there was no way to get people mobilized until after the first of the year. But immobilized we have. And I'm really proud to say that the grassroots organizations have been extremely busy and helpful, and as of today, we do have almost 70,000 comments of citizens, and there will be more formal comments. That's what will, our Heritage and other formal comments, the Center for Competitive Politics. But I'm going to give you two things. I want to talk a little bit about what they would do. I've also distributed it. Here's my job as a lawyer. This is the brilliant legal scholar. This is the brilliant legal scholar. My job is to take things that government is doing and trying to translate it into English. So I have prepared some examples that you can pick up out there that just gives you some scenarios of how these proposed regulations would work in real life. And it's really quite shocking, but let me just go through some of the things that are paramount in these proposed regulations. The regulations would create a new category of something called candidate-related political activities. That's not a term of legal art in the Internal Revenue Code today. And it would say that these kinds of activities, if engaged in by a 501c4 advocacy organization, the C4 category is really the catch-all. It's the miscellaneous category for the type of organization. The reason people say, well, why do you even do that? Well, look, I mean, I said this before. When you want to do something in America, the first thing, if you want to open a bank account, the first thing you have to do is you have to get a number from the IRS, an employer ID number. For each of us, it's our Social Security number. But for an artificial entity, it's an employer ID number. And when you get that number, you have to tell the IRS, this is the kind of legal entity we're going to be. And the 501c4 is a catch-all, miscellaneous. But it encompasses the advocacy groups, advocating everything for and against everything. And it's not a group of business people trying to promote a particular industry. It's not a labor union. It's not a social club. It's just a catch-all everything. And what these rules would do is say that for this type of legal entity, and only this type of legal entity, the following activities would no longer count toward these organizations' primary purpose, which would mean that the organizations would have to track all their expenditures and volunteer hours, when that's not defined anywhere. So if you have a group that's all volunteers, you have to calculate the value of the volunteer hours. And that then is all, it goes into the bucket that doesn't count toward the organization's primary purpose. Well, under present law, and this is one of the things we don't know because they've asked for comments on this, 50.1% of a C4's expenditures, program expenditures, have to be spent on things that fall within the primary purpose. And now then, this bucket is getting bigger and bigger on the side that doesn't count toward a primary purpose. So all those hard-won finally got letters of recognition of exempt status from the IRS last year, guess what? They're endangered immediately if these regulations take effect. Registering voters. That's one of the things that wouldn't count toward a primary purpose. Nonpartisan voter registration. You don't even have to mention a candidate, but if you're registering voters and you're a C4, doesn't count. If you're doing voter guides or get out the vote, say you're running a ballot issue campaign, you never mention a candidate. That get out the vote activity is considered wouldn't count towards your primary purpose. Hosting candidate debates, candidate forums, so maybe people would come out and hear from candidates and ask them questions rather than just relying on 30-second ads. No, we don't want people to do that. Well, that would be a terrible thing. That's not going to count towards your primary purpose. Inviting elected officials to come and speak to your group. Well, you see, they're candidates. And some of these things are limited in time to 30 days before a primary and 60 days before a general election. Many other of these proposed regulations are not limited in time. So anytime you do voter registration, anytime you do a voter guide, anytime you do host a candidate speaking, that could be not counted towards your primary purpose. And one of the things, I mean, I could go on and on about the way these are so sloppily drafted. At least the FEC regulations under BICRA for electioneering communications, radio and TV ads that reference or depict a clearly identified federal candidate 30 days for a primary, 60 days for a general, they have to be targeted to the people who actually vote for that candidate. Not so with these. So presumably you could have a candidate from California speak to a group in Illinois, and that's a candidate-related political activity. Doesn't count towards your primary purpose. Grassroots lobbying, if you are urging people to vote for or against something and say, call your congressman, if it's 30 days before a primary, 60 days before a general, it doesn't count towards your primary purpose, which of course flies right in the face of recent Supreme Court decisions. Publishing legislative scorecards. I mean, just basically all the things that are done to try to hold public officials accountable for doing in office what they say they're going to do when they're candidates. And all of that is now going to be not something that counts toward primary purpose for a C4 organization. We can talk about more of that later, but I want to just, before I close, I want to tell you this other second thing. I have not been aware until I got involved in this, the extent to which the Internal Revenue Service contends on a normal, regular, customary basis that federal laws that have been enacted by Congress just simply do not apply to the IRS. Such things as the Administrative Procedures Act, which all federal agencies are supposed to be bound by. IRS it guarantees notice and hearing, due process rights to the citizens. The IRS says that doesn't apply to them. These proposed regulations, the IRS says, there's no paperwork implication of this other than this one tiny little part that they, but all the rest of this counting of volunteer hours, all that, none of that. The Paperwork Reduction Act doesn't really apply to us. That's what they told the Office of Management and Budget. They did no analysis under the Regulatory Flexibility Act, the issue of how many small entities will this involve, and the most troubling of all, two last most troubling things. On December the 10th, I filed a FOIA request on behalf of Tea Party Patriots seeking all of the related documents that went into making this rule. They came back and said, after 30 days, they needed till the end of the month, and then they came back and said, we can't get those to you until April the 7th. That is what, 6 weeks after the close of the comment period? But on the website of regulations.gov, where these regulations are posted, and it says related documents, it says none. So there are no documents, but it's going to take them till April 7th to get them to us. And finally, we know now from one of the things that is most interesting to me is agencies are required to tell the public what rules they are contemplating. They're supposed to submit those to the public so that it's publicly known when they're considering developing regulations. These were developed off-plan. There was no notice prior to the time when they popped up Thanksgiving week. And again, I mean, these are all violations of federal law that are supposed to protect the citizens. So there's a lot there to work with to sue them, if indeed they do move forward with pushing these through, which I fully expect that they will try to do. But I do think that one of the things that, as I said to a group the other night, when I realized how long apparently the IRS and who knows what other agencies, I just haven't paid attention to this particular thing, have just been willfully disregarding federal law, and I think about all the years that the Congress was controlled by Republicans, I want to scratch every one of their eyes out, every Republican, because they have not been doing their jobs, and they're still not doing their jobs of oversight of executive agencies. And it is the one thing I think that we really have to start demanding. Do your jobs. Get these agencies in check. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank everybody for coming out.
Wow.
Thank you for the gracious introduction. Thank you for your nice comments always. I'm the lucky one. I get to sit next to Cleta, which is always a treat for me. First thing I want to emphasize in talking about these rules, something that is often overlooked, and I find, again, people seem to unable to kind of recognize the importance of this. These rules have nothing to do with raising federal revenue. If these rules are adopted, revenue will not go up, it will not go down. The tax burden of particular groups will not go up, it will not go down, right? At least it doesn't need to, okay? All of this then, what is the driving motivation here then? This is an effort to regulate campaign finance. It's a campaign finance regulation disguised as a tax regulation. And that comes up because after Citizens United, Congress was unable to pass the Disclose Act, which Senator Schumer announced said when he was announcing it was intended to deter political speech. Congress was unable to pass that. They were unable to get the FEC to act on it for reasons that are important and that I will talk about. And so now they're trying to do it through the tax code. The main difference that would occur if this rule became law would be that these organizations would probably have to refile under Section 527 of the tax code, and that would require that would give them more reporting burdens, and most importantly, it would require that they disclose all the names of their donors. And all of us have seen that the current effort is to not really name and shame, but name and harass these particular donors. I'll let the ladies here talk a bit more, I think, about that aspect of it. But once we recognize that this is really campaign finance regulation dressed up as tax regulation, we can begin to start seeing all the many problems with it. The IRS says that this is following the Federal Election Campaign Act, and that the basic structure borrows from the Federal Election Campaign Act, and that is in using this 60-day window that Cleta mentioned to regulate all of this activity and say if you engage in this activity, you won't be able to remain a C4 organization, at least if you do too much of it. And then you'll be either forced to pay taxes, you'll become essentially like a for-profit corporation, or you'll be forced to disclose all of your donors so that they can be harassed and bothered. It should be noted, though, that there are a number of things first that are different and why the IRS is not well equipped to do this. Let me make one other brief digression here. The Supreme Court has repeatedly said in the campaign finance realm that you cannot require a group to disclose all of its individual donors unless the group's primary purpose is to engage in political activity. And the court has then defined political activity rather narrowly to mean expressly advocating the election or defeat of somebody for office. The position of the IRS is, well, this doesn't all apply if we're just talking about taking away their tax status, right? That's their position. I doubt that you can do constitutionally something indirectly in this way that you can't do directly. But leaving that aside, the IRS is the terrible agency to do it. The FEC, for all of its many faults, some of which it deserves criticism, the FEC is structured in a way that provides certain safeguards. Primarily, it is bipartisan. It has 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats on it, so you cannot pass something on a straight-line party vote. This is very, very frustrating if what you want to do is pass something on a straight-line party vote in order to harass your political opponents. And that's why they've had to go to the IRS, because that is directly controlled by the administration and can be passed on a straight-line party vote. The FEC has other protections. It has a very detailed enforcement process. It also has a process for issuing advisory opinions. And again, I don't claim that the FEC does a wonderful job of getting these advisory opinions out on as timely a basis as it could, but it does have a procedure for expedited determinations in the middle of a campaign and so on. No such procedure exists at the IRS, so it's not equipped to make these kinds of campaign decisions, and it's not equipped to assure the public confidence that these decisions are not being made simply for political gain, but rather have at least enough basis in law and fact that somebody from the opposite party who's a member of the commission agrees, right, to get that majority that you would need at the FEC. Now, the IRS also simply lacks expertise in this area. The reality, and it shows up repeatedly in these rules, is that they simply do not know what they are doing. So if we credit the IRS with the best of intentions, and by the way, I tend to do that, especially with the career people there, and I think most of the career people, my guess is that they're probably appalled at being dragged into this political fiasco by political folks, would be my guess of what's going on. But they don't work in this area. So when they say they're following the Federal Election Campaign Act, they're not. They've got this new definition that Cleta talked about for candidate-related political activity. I like to think of it as candidate-related activities, comma, political, which makes the acronym crap. But they work off this 60-day limit, period. But there is no exemption, for example, for news stories. Now, the Federal Election Campaign Act, of course, includes an exemption for news stories. And we say, well, does that matter? This is only affecting C4s. But there are many newspapers or news publications that are published by C4s, such as the Washington Free Beacon here, or the Washington Examiner, or on the left as well, like the publication of the Center for American Progress, I forget what they call it, is also published by a C4 organization. There's no exemption, for example, for, well, I shouldn't say there's no exemption, I should say it applies to any type of communication. The federal campaign finance law on the 60-day limit window applies only to broadcast ads. So this applies to anything, including web communications. And as the rule is written, you would have to, an organization would have to take down anything on its website mentioning a candidate for the last 60 days before the election. Now, this might include a description from 4 years previous of some passage of a bill or a lawsuit that named a person as a plaintiff or a defendant or anything like that would all have to come down. Again, one might assign nefarious motives to the IRS, or one might just say they don't know what they're doing. Neither one reflects well for putting forward this kind of rule. They would require that the communication merely be intended to reach 500 people. Now, the campaign law requires that it actually reach 50,000 people. And the campaign law actually has a system for how that is determined. Remember, it applies only to broadcast ads, and the Federal Communications Commission actually has that kind of information, and the Federal Communications Commission is required by law to provide the matrix for the FEC, the Election Commission, to determine if it's reaching the 50,000 people. And we lose that completely. Moreover, 500 not only being a very small number, note that it's, and no way to determine it, it's intended to reach 500. How do you know if it's intended to reach 500 people? Now, to the extent that the IRS is saying we want clearer rules, clearer guidelines, and it's true that in the past they have not had a good, clear test, I'm not sure that guessing people's intentions really provides the kind of clarity you want if you're an organization trying to decide what it is that you can do. They also, and by the way, again, the FEC, as Cleta mentioned, has very detailed regulations throughout this area. Similarly, for example, with the definition of candidate. The IRS, the FEC has very clear definitions of candidates, and not only that, it requires that people have spent $5,000 toward that candidacy. Now, $5,000 isn't enough. In my mind, that should be raised, but it's statutory limit. The FEC can't do it on its own. But, you know, you got to spend something. You got to actually be a candidate and start doing something. The IRS definition would include anybody who's been talked about as being a candidate, anybody who's been put forth as a potential candidate. So, you know, if somebody wants to get something going here, you just go, you know, get your person on the McLaughlin group or whatever, say, well, you know, that Hans von Spakovsky would be a great vice presidential nominee. And there he is. He's a candidate, apparently, for the FEC ruling, for the IRS ruling. Note also that this applies to appointed positions, people who never actually run for any kind of office. So it would apply, for example, to judges. Now we know that the Senate just got rid of the ability to filibuster judicial nominees, right? Where is a judicial nominee a candidate? Now the FEC rule, or the IRS proposed rule, doesn't require that it be targeted toward the electorate, but in any case, even if it were, he seems to be a candidate nationally. Now let's think about this. A judicial nominee, there's a primary, the first primary of 2014 is the Texas primary in the first week of March. Under this rule, these 501c4 groups would risk losing their tax status and losing their exemption if they mentioned any judicial nominee at any point after February 2nd, that is 2 weeks ago, essentially. They can't talk about judicial nominees. They can't even report on their prior decisions. They can't even say, you know, Judge Goodwin did this or Judge Badwin did that, right? They just can't even do that stuff anymore. Well, anyway, I'm going to be out of time, but you get a sense for the lack of precision here. It also should be noted that when the Election Campaign Act created this definition, the 60-day window, that law, the McCain-Feingold law, that portion of the law specifically states nothing in this subsection, right, shall be deemed, I'm sorry, I can't read my exhibits here, may be construed to establish, modify, or otherwise affect the definition of political activities or electioneering activities, right, for purposes of the Internal Revenue Code. So they're acting directly contrary to Congress's wishes there, and they're acting just as they're acting contrary to Congress's giving the FEC exclusive jurisdiction over campaign finance laws. There are a number of other problems with this. Again, for time, I'll stop. We can go on some in the questions. There's no volunteer exemption, as Cleta mentioned. Hosting an event, so presumably maybe if you buy 2 tickets that makes you part of a host committee or something like that, you might have problems. Again and again, what I'm trying to get through is we see in these rules that the IRS lacks the expertise. And the entire basis for the big administrative state we have is that agencies will operate in areas in which they have particular expertise and not go pushing this out into other areas. And why is it being pushed on the IRS? Why is this being forced onto the IRS at the same time that the new Commissioner Koskinen is complaining about how he's had to cut staff and they don't have enough budget? Why are they doing this? It is to regulate campaign finance, not revenue. And so I would close by saying that, the easiest thing for the IRS to do is simply to go in the other direction, to say we will determine if somebody is a political committee for tax purposes, that is a Section 527 group, if the FEC determines that it is a political committee. And if it doesn't, it's not. And I would note that the National Taxpayer Advocate, in her special report to Congress last year, wrote very modestly, it may be advisable to separate political determinations from the function of revenue collection. Hear, hear. Thank you.
I think, first, thanks so much to Hans for having me and for organizing this. I think these guys have covered the content of the regulations and what their ramifications would be. I was hoping to take a step back and talk a little bit about how I think the targeting scandal that the IRS admitted to last May is connected to these new regulations and how they fit together, and then where Republicans have made some missteps in this whole process that's unfolded since last May, and where they should be perhaps focusing their efforts. So Hans posed a question on the invitation, which was, is there a coordinated effort to stifle free speech? So I'm not sure if it's a coordinated effort, but I think we can say certainly that top IRS officials have been very useful to the Democrats, as Democrats have called for more regulation of 501c4 groups, and the Democrats have been very useful to top IRS officials. So with regard to the targeting scandal, you've seen that Democrats provided a lot of cover for senior IRS officials who were acting improperly and in a blatantly political way. And I'll go into that in further detail. And now you can see in these proposed regulations, the top IRS officials are really doing the bidding of Democratic politicians. A lot of groups on the left, as these guys mentioned, oppose these regulations. Really, the main people on the left who support them are Democratic politicians who want to shut down 501c4 groups on the right that are pouring a lot of money into electoral politics in the post-Citizens United world. And I think it's important to note that the Republicans have an enormous advantage in 501c4 giving. In the 2012 election, there were 28 groups that gave more than $1 million, that spent more than $1 million. 20 of them were Republican, 7 of them were Democratic, and 1 was independent. So the impact of these regulations would be more on the Republican side than on the Democratic side, though obviously the regulations themselves are bipartisan. So in terms of the targeting scandal, you saw that the outrage expressed by the administration and the Democrats in Congress very quickly subsided. The president told us in May that Americans have a right to be angry about this and that he himself was angry about it. And now we've gotten to the point where he's declaring that there's not a smidgen of corruption in the IRS. So how did that happen? What happened was, I think that the Democrats very ably, when congressional investigators, really Darrell Issa was leading the charge, failed to uncover a concrete link between the White House and the targeting that took place, they said that there was nothing to see here. And Republicans failed utterly to respond to that charge. Elijah Cummings, the ranking Democrat on the Oversight Committee, declared the scandal solved in June of last year, so just 1 month after it was uncovered, because nobody had uncovered a link to the White House, and he said that point blank. And Cummings' chief counsel used to work for the commissioner of the IRS, who was leading the IRS all while this targeting occurred. So what had been uncovered and what is still being uncovered, what's still happening, were that there were efforts to slow roll the applications of conservative groups, and that there had been possibly illegal sharing of information between the IRS and the FEC by people who were openly hostile to the influence of money in politics and to conservatives. So, in other words, there were partisan political actors at top levels of the IRS. Now, there are only 2 political appointees in all of the IRS. That's a commissioner and the top lawyer there. So there were a lot of people there behaving in blatantly political and inappropriate ways. And I don't think that Republicans did a good job articulating that this was the problem that we had and calling Democrats on the carpet for their deliberate obfuscations of what the problem was. And I also don't think that Republicans have effectively articulated what the problem was and what exactly we do about that. So now you have Democrats saying, going to the IRS and asking them to respond to the influx of money from groups like Americans for Prosperity, and the IRS responding to that. So the IRS has said openly, former Commissioner Stephen Miller said, well, we didn't think that there was a problem with these regulations that have been on the books since 1949. We decided to go back and tinker with them because Democrats were complaining about them. And he cited Carl Levin specifically. And so it shouldn't come as any surprise that when you have partisan people at the top levels of the IRS, these are career bureaucrats, not political appointees, that they're going to be receptive to calls from Democrats in Congress. And I don't think that that problem has been effectively articulated by Republicans or that they've proposed a good solution to them. And I guess my conclusion from my reporting on this has been, if we don't solve that problem, we perhaps the outcry from the right and left, we can stop these regulations, we can put an end to the targeting, but with political actors at the very top of every federal agency, these problems are very likely to recur in the future. And so I think Republicans need to propose some sort of solution to just having blatantly political actors with free reign at the very top of the Internal Revenue Service and very likely every other administrative agency in the federal government.
Well, it's so great to be here. When we were all meeting before we came in, Brad very kindly said to us reporters, you're doing yeoman's work. And I said, yeah, who do you think we're talking to as we report all of this out? It has been less than a year since the IRS scandal broke, as it were. And we tend to date this to that time in the spring when Lois Lerner first let slip that, oops, we've done a little bit of targeting at the agency. But I'd like to make the point that this began well before last spring. And this is, in fact, the best way to look at it as a continuum of a new and broad and very determined political strategy that dates back to 2008 and a man named Barack Obama. This is a president and his team of political operatives who have always understood the power of speech, but more importantly, the power of denying it to their political opponents. You go all the way back to the Democratic primary in 2008 in the spring, and you find Bob Bauer, who was the general counsel for the Obama campaign, filing a complaint with the Federal Election Committee against an organization called the American Leadership Project, which was backing his opponent in the primary, Hillary Clinton. Bob Bauer files this complaint, tries to get this group shut down. But he made a public statement at the time, and I think it's very revealing, and I will read it here. Quote, There's going to be a reckoning here. It is going to be rough. It's going to be rough on the officers. It's going to be rough on the employees. It's going to be rough on the donors. Whether it is at the FEC or in a broader criminal inquiry, these donors will be asked questions, which seems to be like a pretty good model for what's happened going forward, if you think about it. You know, and he also, the Obama campaign also went after a group that was supporting John Edwards. And what was notable is Politico wrote a story around the time saying that while it wasn't clear if these complaints were in fact going to go anywhere, the damage, quote, had been done. It had had its intended effect in that it had scared off donors from giving money to the campaigns of his rivals in the primary. Also in 2008, around August of 2008, you saw a political operative who was a supporter of President Obama. His name is Tom Matzey. He created his own 501c4, interestingly, and he called it Accountable America. He explained that his group was going to start by sending, quote, warning letters to 10,000 GOP donors, quote, hoping to create a chilling effect that will dry up contributions. And the letters would alert, quote, right-wing groups to a variety of potential dangers, including the legal trouble they could get into if they didn't know what they were doing in terms of the IRS and other federal agencies. So this is all still back in 2008. Also in August, Bob Bauer attacked, and I think Cleta knows all about this case, the American Issues Project, which was run by a group that had it had run an ad, an unflattering ad against President Obama. Bob Bauer would send ultimately 3 letters to the criminal division of the Justice Department calling for a prosecution against this group. He would also complain to the FEC, and he'd use the tax code to get AIP to turn over documents to him. So this was something that had been in the works for a very long time. You fast forward, keep going, the Supreme Court issues its Citizens United decision. The Democrats, as Brad mentioned, failed to pass their Disclose Act, which they were hoping to use to shut up a lot of conservative groups. And you have 2010 and the president having a lot of trouble. He knows they're headed into a rough electoral season. So, and you also have all of these Democrats who are very creeped out about this as well, too. And 2010 is a very notable year. First, you have the president in front of the entire nation berating the Supreme Court in his State of the Union address, talking about the ramifications of the shady money that's going to come out of the fact that they are allowing more free speech. You now have, and I actually went back, there's a fascinating timeline. The president himself gave more than 12 speeches in the course of the campaign season, warning day after day about shadowy conservative groups. He warned that nobody knows who's paying for these ads. He said, we don't know if it's a foreign-controlled corporation, which, by the way, is illegal. And it wasn't just President Obama, okay? You have Democratic campaign committees putting out the same drumbeat day after day, warning about shadowy right-wing groups, 501c4s. You have David Axelrod going on the press constantly, making the same point. You have the Huffington Post reporting that in September that a senior administration official gathered together a small and select group of reporters to advocate that they start writing about this very invidious threat to the nation. Conservative right-wing groups who were engaged in political free speech. You also have, as Eliana mentioned, congressional Democrats sending letters to the IRS demanding that they do something about these groups, saying these groups were improperly engaged in campaigns. So that brings us to the IRS targeting. And anybody wonders why this happened? We actually spent several months having a discussion about how and why this happened, given this backdrop. Remember the press, everyone was looking around to see, sniffing, did the president make a telephone call to someone at the IRS telling them to do this? Or was there some deep throat meeting in an underground garage somewhere? He didn't need a telephone. He had a megaphone. And he went out and said this every day. And we know that the IRS was paying attention. Now, as mentioned, the president has of late, since this fall, come up with a new reason, new answer, new storyline for what happened here. According to him, just some poor officials at the IRS were very confused about what was going on. This is a very complicated law. I mean, as Cleta will note, these regulations in their current form have been on the books since 1959, okay, for 50 years. And nobody had an enormous amount of difficulty dealing with them before. And if you talk to Dave Camp, who runs the House Ways and Means Committee, he will point out that nowhere in their entire investigation, in all of the emails that they have collected, in everything that they have looked through, have they found a single instance of an IRS official saying, oh, gosh, I'm just really confused about what to do here. Okay. What they have found a great deal of is evidence that the IRS, its officials, both its career and its political officials, were hyper aware of the political environment that had been building up for the last 3 or 4 years. You know, one of the first emails that suggested that there was an issue here, there was an email from a screener out in Cincinnati. He flagged the case he was looking at for Washington. And this is what his email read. Recent media attention to this type of organization indicates to me that this is a high-profile case. Okay, there was no mention of confusion, but rather all of the attention to these type of organizations and who was directing attention at them, this administration. Now we have the rule that came out, as Cleta said, dropped in the quiet of the Thanksgiving holidays. And one thing I would add, again, Camp's committee has noted that it looks very much to them as they read through this, and I think this is a really important point, is they have read through this regulation. It looks very much to them as though this rule was reverse engineered, meaning somebody took a look at all of the organizations that had been targeted prior by the IRS and then drafted these rules to make sure that they could encompass those groups again, but in a formalized fashion. We also have a new email from 2012 from a Treasury attorney that was sent to Lois Lerner and others that were at the tax-exempt portion of the IRS. It cites a blog post about 501c4s, and it reads, I don't know who in your organization is keeping tabs on C4s, but since we mentioned potentially addressing them off-plan in 2013, I've got my radar up. What does that mean? It means these rules have been in the works for years, okay? And Camp's committee has in fact come out and said that their interviews with other IRS officials have suggested that people were looking at doing these rules all the way back in 2011. So when we sit and talk about the basis of this, how it came up, this has been going on since this president took office. It's part of a coordinated political campaign against the president's opponents in elections. You know, one last thing I would just add here to give you a sense of how much this administration cares about these rules. These were not things that were just tossed off the cuff. If you go back to the most recent budget negotiation that Congress just passed, as they got toward the end and all the main things were finished, the president came back to House Republicans and said that there was some more money that they wanted. And he had some lists of things that he wanted them to devote more money to, things like his pre-kindergarten initiative, and I think there was something for IMF. Republican negotiators told him that they would be willing to talk about any of those if the IRS would simply pull these rules for a while until the investigations could be completed and we knew what had happened. And the White House said no. So they are very committed to getting these on the books. This is one of their strategies going forward to try to shut down political speech against their opponents. And I think all of that is just worth bearing in mind as we talk about the rules themselves. Thanks.
Thanks. Okay, we have time for questions. And if you would, this is being broadcast on the internet. So if you have a question, if you would wait till a microphone comes to you so folks out in the rest of America can hear what you're saying. And I would ask you two things. One, please identify yourself. And second, please ask a question rather than making a statement. Thanks. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Penny Starr, CNS News. Regulations, as we know, can be rammed through without congressional oversight. So what can be done to stop these regulations at this point?
Well, we're thinking of everything we can do. A number of us filed comments at the Office of Management and Budget in January, which is the first step to be able to publicly say why these are horrible and all the ways that they violated statutes and requirements of federal law. The comment period will end a week from yesterday, 6 days from now, and we've been working really hard to, many of us working very hard to try to explain to people what this would mean so that there would be the opportunity and people would make public comments. And even the new IRS commissioner testified 2 weeks ago that at that point there were fewer than 20,000 comments, that this was the largest number of comments from the public on any rulemaking. He said of any agency ever, and I think that may well be true. It might not be true because of the comments to the FEC when the FEC was considering regulating the internet back in the early 2000s. But you know, look, and we've asked for hearings. I've urged everybody, ask for a hearing, ask for multiple hearings. Once the comment period closes, they don't have to have a hearing, but I think enough people have asked for one that it would not be prudent for them to ignore that. But look, I mean, they can just disregard everything. And I mean, it's not supposed to happen this way if we were a nation of laws and not of men. But since we're not any longer, then they could just, you know, go through the motions and then issue the regulations, and then we will have to file suit.
Much of the effort now is first to, you know, make an effort to convince them not to do this. And again, I suspect that in the IRS there are a lot of career employees who would like not to do that. It's possible it could carry the day. I suspect it's more likely, as Kim indicated, these rules are cooked. They're already baked in the cake, signed, waiting, or at least sitting on the desk waiting to be signed. Having said that, the comments are the biggest thing we've got, and building a record that can be used. The agency does have to respond to comments and justify it. So at the website of the Center for Competitive Politics, which is www.campaignfreedom.org, it's campaignfreedom.org, there is a link there for IRS. It's right up on the top banner. And that from there, people can see other documents, other comments, and link directly to the IRS site on the web where you can submit comments. Now, individual comments, even if they're very short, are very helpful, but especially what are most helpful, you know, if people have small nonprofits or other groups or experience as a CPA, you don't have to make long comments, especially, you know, given the time frame. Even a one-page, a two-paragraph letter that can go a little bit beyond just saying, don't do this, but actually say, here is why these rules are going to be a problem, or we think these rules would be a big problem for my small nonprofit. You don't even have to go into the details. I think that's about the most concrete thing people can do now. So again, you can get there. It's campaignfreedom.org. Click on the IRS heading. It'll take you right to where you can file comments on the web.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Tyler O'Neill with the Christian Post. I would just like to ask the entire panel if you agree with the outline that Kimberly presented and whether or not it could provide grounds for charging a high crime or misdemeanor against the president.
I absolutely agree with Kim's outline and the scenario. If you're asking whether or not I think we ought to pursue impeachment, are you crazy? I mean, that would be, we have a hard enough time getting our guys to actually decide to try to say that these are bad regulations. And there are some who finally started saying that in the last couple of weeks, but, you know, let's get real here.
I do agree with Tom. I agree with Cleta. You know, it's not going to be, impeachment's not in the cards, and I'm not sure that it should be. I don't know. But I would say this, and this is what Kim's point emphasizes. You know, the famous story Henry II said of the Archbishop of Canterbury hearing his latest words. He says, well, no one rid me of this turbulent priest.
Right.
And the guy said, oh, okay. And a bunch of knights rode off and rid him of the turbulent priest, murdering the Archbishop of Canterbury. You don't need, you know, he didn't need to send them a letter or give them a direct order to have some level of responsibility there. And it is worth naming names. Unfortunately, I kind of have to do this by memory, but among the Democratic office holders who have, I know from memory, I'm only saying the ones I'm absolutely sure of, wrote to the IRS urging them to investigate conservative groups, and many of these letters urged them to investigate specific groups by name, were Senator Franken, Senator Baucus, Senator Whitehouse, Senator Merkley, Senator Bennett, Senator Schumer, and Representative Peter Welch of Vermont. Levin, of course. I believe Durbin was one. Anyway, these people deserve to be named, and they deserve to be called out for what is, a raw partisan effort to silence their political opposition. There's not really any other way around that. And they're the ones who've really escaped everything. You know, people are looking around, where's the smoking gun of the White House? The guns are lying all over the place. The smoke's puffing up, and everybody's like, where's the White House,
I agree with what both Cleta and Brad said, and that was, right after the scandal broke, I remember Mitch McConnell and Marco Rubio taking to the floor of the Senate and saying, there's a culture of intimidation that this administration has brought to bear on its political opponents, and that's exactly what Elijah Cummings seized on and said, there is no evidence that the White House has done anything, had any connection to this scandal, but the timeline Kim laid out, I think was totally accurate, and it did create a culture of attempting to clamp down on one's political opponents. And during the 2010 election, the Koch brothers were, the Democrats didn't really have a platform. It was a very difficult year for them, but their platform was really an anti-Koch platform. And in my reporting and in talking to some of the people, at Koch, they said they raised the point of donor anonymity, and they said, the reason that the donors to some of our 501c4s want anonymity is because they don't want to be harassed in the way that Charles and David Koch have been harassed. They don't want death threats. Their business owners don't want people boycotting their businesses and so on and so forth. But when the administration is talking in this way, and the people at the top levels of the IRS are receptive to what Barack Obama is saying, there was this hilarious moment in one of these hearings when Elijah Cummings looked at, there was a woman screening Tea Party applications in Cincinnati, and she was testifying, and he said, did you ever get a phone call from the White House directing you to do this? And she had this totally confused look on her face, like, what on earth are you talking about? And it's like, yeah, of course, they didn't need to do something like that, but when you have senior leadership that's receptive to the message coming out of the White House, you don't need to pick up the phone.
Can I just add one quick thing here too? This is not limited to the IRS. All right,
Right.
Look at what
The FEC.
Dick Durbin, though, is doing to the American Legislative Exchange Council, for instance. And we didn't talk about this much, but this also gets to one aspect of these rules, donor disclosure, okay? Everyone loves the word transparency, but I think everyone has to think very hard about what that means in the political context sometimes, because right now there is a concerted effort to use donor disclosure to then tee up and attack certain groups and also use that to silence them. And so this isn't just happening within the realm of campaign finance or the IRS. It's happening in a lot of different areas.
I should add, just on Kim's point, and I was telling these guys this beforehand, I've also found this to be an area in which the Republican Congress is not sensitive, in that these big 501c4 groups that would be impacted, I placed a call to one of the committees and said, what's your take on the way that these regulations would impact the big 501c4 groups, Crossroads, GPS, or Americans for Prosperity? And the response I got back, the woman said, let me talk with our legal counsel. They said, these groups, like these big groups, they'll just find a way. They'll become C6s or 527s. 527 group, they have to list all of their donors. And I don't think, among Republicans in Congress, there is really an adequate sensitivity, and that paints it with a very broad brush. But the response I got was not really it wasn't what I would have expected, or perhaps what many of you would have expected from some of Republican representatives in Congress.
Yeah, right over there in the front.
Hi, Phil Kerpen, American Commitment. We're going to have Chairman Camp's bill on the House floor next week, 3865, which would prohibit these rules from being issued in final form this year. It's a pretty modest bill. They could still do it next year, but couldn't do it in the middle of a tax year, which seems particularly ridiculous, but nonetheless seems like something they want to do. Will there be, do you guys, particularly the reporters, think there's going to be any coverage of this vote? Will anyone care? Will it just be a party line vote and a series of party line votes that's ignored? Will there be any shame attached to Democrats? It was straight party line in the markup with nothing interesting said. So I'm just wondering if
Yeah, I
there's
wouldn't
any
hold my
opportunity
breath
there.
that it's going to be on the front page of many newspapers. I mean, I think one of the shame of this, of all of this, has been. I mean, this is a scandal, as bad as they get. This is an agency that has abused its power grievously against American citizens, and that ought to be an enduring story. It was covered for a bit when it happened, you know, because it was hot and that the press was all over it. I don't know if you all remember, but it happened. There was this sort of trio of bad news for the administration at the time, too, so it was all kind of coming. But, you know, I have noticed that as this has died down and as the president has come up with his new storyline for how this all happened, just a bunch of confusion at the IRS, you know, the press has been happy to accept that. And they've also been happy to accept the argument that, I mean, one of the things that I find the slickest aspect of these rules is not just that they're, in essence, formalizing the target that they did before, but they're using it as an excuse for what happened in the targeting. They're saying, well, we have to put out these regulations because of all the confusion which caused the targeting in the first place. So now we're going to formalize our targeting to take care of the targeting we did in the first round, which is very clever. But, you know, and it's something, unfortunately, I think that a lot of people are happy to accept as the perceived wisdom. So Camp's, you know, bill will come forward, and there'll be some coverage of it. But I've been very disappointed in the level of interest in general in the media by these new rules and what they mean.
Yes, sir.
Milton Grenfell. These Democratic congressmen who have made these recommendations to the IRS, are these not illegal things they're recommending? And if they're illegal, you know, couldn't these people be held accountable for conspiracy?
Well, on behalf of True the Vote, we filed an ethics complaint 2 weeks ago against Elijah Cummings with the Office of Congressional Ethics, because Catherine Engelbrecht, as many of you may know, after she filed her application for a C3 and a C4, she and her family began to be targeted by various federal agencies, and Elijah Cummings began to wage this war against her and against True the Vote. Went on MSNBC, lots of media interviews attacking Catherine, attacking True the Vote, demanding information from them, et cetera, a series of letters demanding that she come to Washington and explain herself, et cetera. And I think Brad was the one who mentioned his, the chief minority counsel of the Oversight Committee, who works for Representative Cummings, is someone who worked in the IRS Commissioner's office at the time when the targeting began, and you know, she's moved back and forth, and is a very well-known in liberal Democratic circles as a real activist who thinks we're all nuts. And so we filed a complaint with the Office of Congressional Ethics saying we want to know whether or not he abused his power, whether he or anyone on his staff were involved in any way in the interagency, multiple agency attacks. And, you know, Jenny Beth Martin, who's standing in the back of the room, the Tea Party Patriots, and we've talked about the fact that, you know, maybe we should gather, we've gathered the letters. There were 9 senators who sent letters, Democratic senators who sent letters to the IRS demanding action be taken against these C4 organizations, and that maybe we should file an ethics complaint. You know, maybe the problem is we're not very good about going on offense. They're really good at going on offense. And, you know, as I always say, you know, these people don't want transparency. They want a target list. And they want to make it so that that donors, conservative donors, look at what they do to Charles and David Koch and say, I ain't wanting any of that. So I'll tell you what, I just am not going to write checks. I think there's a whole area of the scandal that we have not explored that we need to get our arms around, which I'm becoming convinced that people were targeted for audits, personal and business audits based on their political contributions and their contributions to conservative groups. And, you know, trying to get our arms around that and see to that. But look, I mean, we need to go on offense. It's hard to do when we are constantly battling the incoming hand grenades. So.
Right here in the front.
Diane Frieda with Bloomberg BNA. I'm wondering if any of you see the potential for an injunction against the rules, considering that we have this Loving decision now where some Chevron questions were raised, and some of them, some attorneys have said, could be the same things that could be raised with these proposed rules.
Well, I'll let the legal scholar.
Oh, I was say, you know, that may be just getting ahead of the game. We'll have to see what rules they would adopt and what final form they would put them in. It's a pretty drastic step to have an injunction against moving forward with them. So, you know, it's always going to be tough to do. And well, that's not something I would count on. I guess is the way to put that. But I can, you know, assure that I think every legal avenue will be taken under federal administrative law rules to show that these rules are arbitrary and capricious, not justified. If they are put into place. And, you know, one thing that I just kind of laugh at, it's only tangentially related, but again, it goes back to this idea of expertise. I hope the IRS folks have thought about the fact that all those cases, Wisconsin Right to Life versus FEC, you know, and Massachusetts Citizens for Life versus FEC, and Citizens United versus FEC, the next decade are going to be Citizens United versus IRS, you know, Wisconsin Right to Life versus IRS. And that, to me, indicates this is a campaign finance regulation masquerading as tax law, and there will be legal grounds to attack it.
But one of those
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you know, the one thing I think that a point we can make, and I see this in some of the comments that are being filed, some of the more legalistic formal comments, that federal courts tend to give deference to agencies in rulemaking and in interpreting statutes and that sort of thing. But they do that on the basis of, I mean, you talk about the Chevron case, and they give deference to agencies because it's their area of expertise. And there is going to be a good body of law, or body of comments that create the reason we're filing all these comments is to make sure that we have covered the bases legally. But I think there will be a good number of comments that will point out, as Brad has today, that the IRS is entitled to no deference on these comments because they don't know what they're doing.
Okay, we got time for one more question there in the back.
Thank you. Excuse me for not giving my name or affiliation. You all have been talking about intimidation within federal agencies. I leave it to you to think about whatever it is. I hope.
By the way, I'm not really Brad Smith either, and I don't really work for the Center for Competitive Politics.
Hans certainly knows who I am, and I hope I'm out of the cameras. We've heard a fair amount about, just in the news, and also there's been some discussion today about how one or another member of Congress, a Republican member of Congress, has been, or might be proposing a law to stop, a bill to stop this or the other. And I think we all know that those bills are never going to go anywhere. I was struck by the comment that we should perhaps think of ways to go on the offensive, and maybe an embarrassment offensive would be good. How about if someone were to propose a bill that says that the policies and tactics used by the IRS during the period from this period to this period shall be lawful for any future administration, or something like this, so that we would force the Democrats to say, do they really want to put those keys into someone else's hands? They would be the ones voting against it. I would hope the Republicans would too, but perhaps that would be an embarrassing thing. Do you approve of what they did, or don't you? I'm just asking.
I think they all say they don't approve of it. It was a terrible thing, but all this confusion, that's why.
Gotta fix the confusion. You know, one thing that I do think could be done and needs to be done better, and people have mentioned this. Cleta, I think she said she wanted to scratch everybody's eyeballs out. But, you know, Congress does hold one very important tool, and it's the power of the purse. And John Koskinen, the new IRS commissioner, has been on a campaign pleading poverty, saying we have all these new things the IRS needs to do, the FACT Act and Obamacare, and we don't have enough people, and you cut our budget. And I think it was Bustani recently said, well, you know, why don't you give us the papers we've asked for, and then maybe we'll look at your budget again. And I think that that's a start, but there's a lot more that you could do there in terms of budgeting and appropriations to make clear that that's how you send messages to a lot of these agencies. And the Republicans ought to be, I think, demanding a lot more from the IRS for the money it's getting, for money it's giving, rather.
All right, everyone, thank our panelists again for coming. And we thank everyone for coming to Heritage for this. Thank you.